Coming up, the search for economic miracles.
So here, all these dots I connected up and I said, this is not going to work out the way people think it will. And economic success is very, very hard to sustain.
Morgan Stanley's Sharma discusses China, India, Brazil, and other emerging markets and how to find the next breakout states. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker is Sharma, whose book, Breakout Nation, has been its own breakout bestseller for some time now. Mr. Sharma is head of emerging market equities and global macro at Morgan Stanley, where he manages around $25 billion in emerging market assets. Previously, he spent many years as a contributing editor for Newsweek and as a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and the Economic Times.
Late 2010, a couple of things happened, which is what gave me the big theme for this book. It had been an extraordinary decade for all developing countries. Never before in the history of economic development had so many countries done as well as they did over the last decade. Just to put that number in context, the average growth rate of developing countries in the 1950s and 1960s was about 5% per year. In the 1970s, it was a bit lower, but somewhat similar. 1980s and 1990s, that growth rate dropped to 3.5%, as there were so many crises in various emerging markets. And then in 2003 onwards, that growth rate jumped to 7.5% a year. And from 2003 to 2008, we sustained that boom of growing at an average pace of about 7.5% per year. And we all came to celebrate this era as being this era where this mass rise of emerging markets was taking place. The power was shifting away from the developed world with the narrative of the US in decline, the Western world in decline, and these powers were rising in the emerging world. And this narrative got even stronger after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, because it was seen to be a Western financial crisis, and these countries were very badly affected. And it was seen that these emerging markets would continue to do that well. And that confidence was quite apparent to me in some of my visits to emerging markets in late 2010, when the capital flows were really gushing in. So one of those things, by which I sort of begin my book in terms of what sort of gave me some cause for concern, because as an investor, we are always looking for the flaw in the conventional wisdom, because too often have we seen that when something becomes conventional wisdom, how that sort of comes to an end. And every decade there's been some hot trend which has captured the imagination of the entire world. And often what we find is that hot trend in one decade is rarely the hot trend in the subsequent decade. And that big trend of the last decade, as I said, was this rise of all these emerging markets. That's what was really like the big trend. And the acronym BRIC sort of accurately captured this, because these were the 4 largest emerging markets. And the rise of the BRICS was what, had everyone fascinated. So here in late 2010, I was touring some of the BRIC countries, and it struck me as to what this overconfidence had, or the levels that this overconfidence had reached. I was in India. India has its own equivalent of Christmas around the November time, there in early November. And I went to my home city of Delhi. And in Delhi, I was invited for one of these Diwali parties. At night, there were all sorts of fancy cars that the valets were juggling out there, the Jaguars and the Bentleys and other things. Of course, you entered in there and you had food from all over the world, chefs flown in from Italy, Azerbaijan to sort of lay it out for you. And then I got chatting with this young 25-year-old person there. This guy was seemed to me like this typical sort of rich, spoiled brat, wearing this very tight black T-shirt, his hair sort of spiked with gel, and the techno beat was beating in the background. And this was late 2010. India's growth rate was at 9%, when the rest of the world seemed to be sort of unfolding, or at least the West seemed to be unfolding back then. And he sort of got talking with me, very quickly figured out, like who I was, and thought that I was some large investor from Wall Street looking to sort of make some investments in India. And he sort of looks at me and then goes, where else will the money go, right? So here's this cocksure guy at this age of 25 who hasn't seen that much of the world, who's seen too many cycles, but he's seeing me here and is saying, where else will the money go, right? So now that sort of makes me really concerned, because I've seen emerging markets for 20 years. Exactly like a decade ago, my mind went back, and nobody wanted to hear about emerging markets in the late 1990s, because the growth market in the world was the NASDAQ, and it was the tech bubble, and emerging markets were seen to be these mosquito-laden, rat-infested kind of places where you sort of, like didn't need to sort of take all this risk, because they had one crisis after another. There was the Russian crisis, there was the East Asian financial crisis. So the whole point was, what's the point of going to all these countries when you're getting such great growth and returns back here in the US? That was the sentiment in the late 1990s. Fast forward like to a decade, and there it was, this guy basically telling me that where else will the money go? It's got to come here. So it sort of like intrigued me when somebody was saying that. And then shortly after that, I went to Russia. I was invited there to speak at a conference. At this conference, the then Prime Minister Putin was also going to be there. I was not quite aware of what the setup was going to be like, but I sort of strolled in there, and much to my surprise, I saw that this was going to be telecast live, and all the sort of bells and whistles attached to that. But I'd made a presentation, and like investors, I'm used to sort of speaking my mind. And so like I made a frank presentation out there about how Russia sort of, how much we used to like Russia at the beginning of the decade, and what Putin did was good for Russia. Like he brought in stability, he cut taxes, and he sort of, like had a sort of informal deal with all the oligarchs that you keep out of politics and you stick to your own fields, and like all will be fine. And then Russia saw like a big boom. But my point now was that model has run its course, that the price of oil has gone up a lot over the past decade, a lot more than you expected, and that nothing else was happening in Russia beyond oil and a consumption boom related to it. There was no real manufacturing going on. There's not one company listed on the Russian stock exchange which is a serious manufacturing company, and there's very little going on in terms of the small and medium-sized enterprises, which are typically the lifeline of an economy. I thought, that all was going well. I mean, the Prime Minister was sitting there on the dais, and he was taking notes down, and I thought, hey, this is great, right? I mean, like you make a presentation, and it seems to be well received. But of course, next morning I woke up and I sort of read the press out there, and it was like a rather sharp reaction. It was like, who is this guy who's come here to spoil our party? And the sort of reaction was that we don't need your money, right? Because again, stereotyped as an investor with the money bags, etc. But with so much money flowing in, this sort of advice was gratuitous. We don't really need this advice. Russia is doing just fine. Thanks, but no thanks, as far as your advice is concerned. So now the dots were all beginning to sort of connect up, that this is what was going on. And then there was Brazil that I went to after that. And it just struck me how frightfully expensive Brazil had become. That to stay in Rio at one of those fancy hotels on the waterfront, you were being charged up to $1,000 a night. Like as I write in the book, that buying a Bellini, for a chick, was costing me $25. So that's like a bit sort of outlandish. I mean, much above prices in New York or anywhere else. And a colleague of mine bought a T-shirt, and she said that after one wash, it turned into a handkerchief. She paid $100 for it. So it was, quality adjusted. This was really, really expensive in terms of what Brazil had become. And that's because huge amount of money had flown into Brazil. The currency had doubled in value over the past decade or so, and it was something which really sort of ended up being, you could see like it was really expensive, and it was showing up in the numbers too. That Brazilian exports outside of commodities were just kind of down, and they were importing a lot. They were not being able to make much at home because the currency had made manufacturing quite uncompetitive. So like Now you're connecting these dots, right? Which is that you're going to India, you're going to Brazil, you're going to Russia, you're seeing the level of overconfidence that's come in here, you're seeing the way the prices have gone up. And then, of course, there was the case of China, where the sort of entire sort of belief was that whatever growth rate China sort of says it's going to sort of do with or has done in the past, it would just keep doing that. So here, all these dots I connected up, and I said, this is not going to work out the way people think it will. Because of the fact of the matter is that economic success is very, very hard to sustain. And that's the lesson from the history of economic development. And I've also seen enough cycles in emerging markets to know that this is not going to happen. In any particular decade, about 1/3 of economies are able to grow at 5% or more in emerging markets. The odds that those countries can keep growing for a second decade goes down to 25%. For a third decade, it goes down to 10%. And if you look at the growth league tables, you will see that in the 1950s, the stars used to be some countries that you could never believe. They used to be like the Middle East. In the 1960s, Iran, Iraq used to show up as the stars growing above 5% that decade. Pakistan used to show up. Sometimes Saudi Arabia, sometimes Yemen. So you have all these countries which tended to do really well for a decade or two, but were not able to sustain economic success. That's really the history of economic development. And that's because most countries follow this 4-point cycle, as I call it, which is that you have an economic crisis, they carry out economic reforms. After they carry out economic reforms, some sort of boom takes place, then complacency sets in, and then you get back to having a crisis. This is the 4-point cycle that I find that most countries tend to follow. And very, very few countries are able to reform in a proactive manner and keep growth going. And I think that's what's been the difference, let's say, between even a China and the likes of an India or something, which is that if you look at China last 30 years, it has proactively reformed. Every 5 years, there's been some big bang reform which has kept the Chinese growth engine humming. But eventually, I find that even now that the Chinese leadership, for example, now I'm waiting to see whether they're able to take the next steps for economic reforms. But there are some signs that of fault lines emerging even in China. Like as I said in China, that till about 5 years ago, the Chinese sort of economic miracle looked really good to me. We used to be optimistic on China. And it took about $1 of debt to create $1 of GDP growth in China till about 2007. Last 5 years, it's taken more than $3 of debt to create $1 of GDP growth in China, right? So, you can make out that now to be able to sustain high growth rates as they get richer, as the per capita income level gets higher, it's getting more and more difficult to do so. So my sort of idea for the book was coming through, which is that these hyped up stars are going to face difficulties and challenges because complacency is setting in these countries. And it's time to look for the new stars. And often the new stars are the ones which have been laggards over the past decade or so, and where some new leader is coming in to try and change things. That's typically the rhythm. And my entire sort of point also in this book was that you keep the forecast horizon in terms of what stars you're looking for to a reasonable time frame, which is you keep it to about 5 years, maybe maximum up to a decade. But to talk anything longer than that is complete nonsense. As I say, that the old rule of forecasting used to be that you make as many forecasts as possible and you remind people when you're right. Now, the new rule of forecasting is that you forecast so long out in the future that neither you nor I'll be here to know whether we were right or wrong. And I think that, this is what really, it's come. So when all these fancy projections are made that, these brick economies will be X share of the global economy by the year 2040, 2050, yeah, right? Who will be here to sort of check these forecasts out? In the 1960s, the multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank thought that the next East Asian tigers would be Sri Lanka, Philippines, and Burma. Exactly the three that didn't make it. And in fact, the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, set up their headquarters in Manila in the 1970s, thinking that how Philippines is the second richest economy in Asia, and with a large English-speaking population and having sort of inherited a lot of practices from America, this is going to become the next sort of breakout nation. And it never did. It never lived up to that promise. So to me, this concept of breakout nations, the two most important metrics I wanted to use here when identifying breakout nations was one, that the countries need to grow faster than what people expect them to, and two, that the countries, when you compare growth rates, you have to do it with countries in the same per capita income group. So which are the countries, to summarize, that I think could be the breakout nations over the next 3 to 5 years? So among emerging markets, the countries that I identify here, in the lowest per capita income group, I speak about Philippines, I speak about Indonesia, I speak about Nigeria, possibly doing better than what people expect them to. In the slightly higher income category, I speak about Turkey, I speak about Colombia, I speak about Peru. In fact, that, like the Latin America is very interesting, that you can basically cut it by the Andes, which run in the middle. All the countries on the left are doing well, all the countries on the right aren't doing that well. The left countries is what we call the new Gold Coast. That includes Chile, Peru, Colombia. On the right, you have Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina. And to me, those are the economic disappointments. So it's sort of interesting. And similarly, I think that there will be countries which will do well in Eastern Europe. I feel relatively okay about Poland, which I think is being dragged down a lot now by what's happening in Western Europe. But I think that it sort of has decent structures and in place and good institutions in place. And it sort of checks the box on many of our fronts, and it'll do well. And then you keep getting new surprises. Like one country that I wrote the book I was a bit mixed about, but all of a sudden things are beginning to really stir out there, is Mexico. That Mexico had its back to the wall. Last decade, as emerging markets grew at this breakneck pace of 7% or so, Mexico was growing at 2%. But finally, the people get fed up. They put into power a new leader who promises reforms. And as he begins to deliver on reforms, the prospects begin to change. And there's a sense also in Mexico that they're being left behind by Brazil, because Brazil sort of did so much better than them over the past decade. So all of a sudden, things in Mexico are beginning to stir. There's a reform agenda out there. So this is the opposite of Brazil. In Brazil, after a decade, complacency sets in. In Mexico, after a decade of really doing poorly and lagging, you put into place a new leader, and all of a sudden reforms begin to take place, and the growth rates begin to pick up. So that's why we find Mexico to be increasingly interesting in the Latin American continent. And then what I do in the latest edition of the book is to apply this concept of breakout nations to the developed world as well, and see that which countries in the developed world might end up emerging as breakout nations. And the country that I, surprisingly, I guess for some, come out being really optimistic on is America. Because I think that on many counts and many of the rules of the road that I look for, America ends up looking quite good. If you look at the basics in terms of cost of labor, cost of land, the relative exchange rate, and the other input costs like energy, etc., on all those fronts, America looks very competitive. Wages have been flat, which has got a lot of political heat, obviously, but that's also a reason why manufacturing is now finding it increasingly competitive to come back here, because wages in many parts of the emerging world, like China, have risen a lot. The cost of land here, compared to, let's say, Shanghai or Shenzhen, like setting up an industrial plant in Oklahoma or Alabama is like a fraction of that cost in terms of the land costs. And then you also have the sort of thing that about technology. The US still spends about 1/3 of the total spend in the world on research and development is done in America. And as a share of its economy also, America spends amongst the highest in the world on research and development. So therefore, all the cutting edge technologies and the cutting edge products from Apple to Google or the cloud computing concepts, social networking concepts still tend to come out of here, even though the jobs often are created abroad. I mean, the classic case is, of course, being of Apple, which employs only 50,000 people out here, is about the largest market cap company in the world, but there are like 1 million people in Taiwan who are making Apple products. So this is super efficient and productive, but the fact of the matter is that the real value-added stuff is still happening out here. So these are some of the reasons I end up sort of being optimistic out here. And I know there are a lot of problems, and we speak, and the debt is a real issue out here, the federal debt. But here's the interesting statistic. The only country in the world, major country in the world, which has seen its debt as a share of GDP decline post the global financial crisis is America. And that's because of the private sector debt has come off. So the private sector is doing a really good job here of paring down debt, whether it's corporations, households, the financial sector, they're doing a job even as the government debt has been exploding. But on a net-net basis, it's still a picture which is not as worrisome as what's, let's say, happening in Europe or so. So therefore, I end up being like optimistic out here. In Europe too, we see some signs that some countries are biting the bullet. Not all, but some. Like for example, in Spain, the labor costs have come down a lot. In Portugal, the labor costs have also come down a lot as they try and reform and try and bring down some of the labor costs. Even in Greece, we've seen labor costs come off a lot. Very painful adjustments going on, but it's happening. And lastly, the country that, once again, where something seems to be stirring is Japan. That this country is a huge laggard for the last 20 years, but again, they have a new leader in place, and he's trying to stir the pot. He's doing it first by this monetary big bang in terms of getting the yen to fall and sort of getting inflation to come back from a stage of deflation. But if he also carries out and delivers on his agenda of structural reform, which is of deregulating the economy a bit, doing more trade pacts with the world, then even Japan has a shot of reviving. So this is the classic sort of thing, which is that leaders become laggards, laggards become leaders. There's constant churn which is going on, which is what makes this game for me so fascinating and so interesting. But the key here is that economic success is really hard to sustain. Always be on the lookout for how the dynamics are shifting and which new countries can emerge, and keep your time horizon on that flexible. I think 3 to 5 years, maximum up to a decade, is a reasonable time frame. Anything longer than that, and you're sort of dealing with all sorts of issues and problems. The good news is that I put my money where my mouth is, which is that because as an investor, I'm forced to sort of put my money where my mouth is. And I guess since I've sort of stuck my neck out, 3 to 5 years from now at least, you can hold me accountable, unlike the other people who are forecasting 50 years from now. Thank you.
To what extent and in which direction is economic growth correlated with political liberalism or degree of democracy?
Yeah, great question. Because I looked at this. So what we did here was we looked at all the high growth examples in the world over the last 30 years. And by high growth, I mean countries that were able to grow at 5% or more for a decade. We found 120 such examples over the last 3. Yeah. And then I looked how much, what percentage of these countries were democratic and how many of these countries were authoritarian. Here's the answer, 50-50. Which is basically, what it tells you is that the political system as such, I hate to say it, does not matter for economic growth. What matters is the quality of political leadership and what they're doing for giving the country more economic freedom. So economic freedom is much more highly correlated with economic success rather than the political regimes. Whether it's democratic or authoritarian, it's a 50-50 case.
How important are a country's neighbors when you evaluate it as a potential breakout nation?
I think neighbors are very important, because one of the rules we have is that very often economic miracles tend to take place in clusters, which is that the entire region, when you trade a lot with the region, the entire region benefits. One of the big handicaps India, for example, has is that its trade with its neighbors is very limited. And the same problem has existed in Africa, that intra-regional trade within Africa is very, very limited. And as you know, the more trading relationships you have, the less is the chance of going to war with each other. So I think that it's very important to have the relationships. And I remain optimistic for parts of Eastern Europe for that it's a very good trading union. And I think that they can leverage that to do much better. And some countries have done that over the last 10 to 20 years. In China's case too, I find that their sort of trade with the other countries has increased quite a bit in terms of over the years. And that's a positive sign. But China is such a big country that it's very hard to make that case. But I'd say for most small to medium-sized countries, it is very important to be part of a trading union with your neighbors. That really helps growth decisively. And so like in Africa, the brightest spot I find is the Eastern African region, because they form something called an EAC. And that intra-regional trade could be very helpful for that region.
One of the continents that's gotten a lot of attention recently is Africa, the rise of Africa. A lot of funds are going in there, whether it's private equity. But the only mention you made was Nigeria for your short list. And then, of course, you said the East African community. Do you have any observations?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have a mixed to positive view on Africa. A lot of good things have happened in Africa, which have been spoken about from better institutions, more economic reform which have taken place out there. I think the key thing is there are 54 countries in Africa. And it is important, again, to sort of take country views in Africa as well, rather than sort of thinking Africa is one homogeneous entity. And also to take into account what's going to happen with lower commodity prices. Because so far, what we've seen is that despite the very high commodity prices in Africa over the last decade, there's been no manufacturing or industrialization taking place in Africa. It's all been about commodities and about the African consumer, as they've got some increased wealth, largely flowing through the commodity boom, doing relatively okay. But the fault line still remains that there's been zero sort of manufacturing or industrialization growth in Africa. And that is a fault line. But I'd say that the key, therefore, is I speak about these two regions, whether it's Nigeria or about East Africa, because they sort of at least meet some of the criteria. Like in Nigeria, they have a new political leader who's trying to do something a bit better, still controversial, but at least he's not pillaging the country's wealth, as every single Nigerian leader has done the last 40 years or so. So it's a positive. East Africa, I spoke about the union, at least it's a positive. So look for something different happening in these places on a regional or a country basis. But with 54 countries, it's very hard for me to make a generalization. Thank you very much. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.